I imagine things may have changed maybe for younger women. Maybe they have it a little easier, but I still see a lot of women when we do transactions with partners that the woman is deferring to the man in that case, and he's making the majority of the decisions. And I just feel like they need to be empowered. They need to know that they've got this ability, that they do have what it takes to make those decisions and to trust their instincts.
Welcome to the Debt to Financial Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Victor Lagos. I'm also the founder and CEO of Lagos Financial, which is a residential and commercial mortgage brokerage specializing in helping investors create wealth through property and other strategic investments. So today I've got Christine McCarron. She actually interviewed me on her podcast not too long ago, and I invited her to come back onto mine because we had really good conversations, and I really wanted to unpack more about, I guess, what you do, Christine. But before I ask you, I guess, some questions and we start to really, dig a bit deeper, quick introduction. Christine McCarron from Beehive Brokerage. She went from less than $0 to a 7-figure net worth starting at age 50. Thanks to real estate investing. So through her coaching, courses, podcasts, and books, she loves sharing what she's learned to help other women exceed their expectations and create a legacy. Welcome, Christine.
Thanks, Victor. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So you mentioned about women. So that's something that really didn't come up in our last conversation, but do you want to share a little bit around, why you're so passionate about helping women in this space?
I feel like so there are a lot. It's not just women who don't get those conversations at home. It's not just women who don't, whose parents don't talk to them about wealth and how to handle their money and things like that. But I do feel like it's more pervasive for women, that there are women who are married who don't know how to balance their checkbook. I don't even actually know if that's a thing anymore, but they don't know where the bank accounts are. They don't know what kind of investments they have. And then, since women outlive men in general, they've got 10, 12 years when they don't know what the heck's going on, so, and especially with real estate investing, I feel like a lot of women find it intimidating, right? The idea of knocking on the door to get the rent, and this 6'5" hairy guy answers the door, and you're like, oh no. So I like to help women to see how it is possible for them to do real estate investing, how they don't have to be afraid of, of collecting the rent and, fixing the toilets and all those kinds of things. They just think, oh, I'm not handy, I can't do it. That's not the case, right? There are a lot of ways to invest in real estate, and they don't all involve fixing toilets at 2 a.m.
Yeah, that makes sense. But when you do a lot of coaching as well, do you find yourself actually coaching women through those particular hurdles that they might perceive exist within the real estate investment space?
Absolutely. I mean, it's all mindset, right? You really have to get to the point where you can envision yourself as a real estate investor, as a person with money, with passive income, a person who isn't answering to a boss, or right, a person who is making life on their own terms. And often that's not the way a woman envisioned herself right along, right? That's not necessarily the way she was raised, and the way, I don't know. I mean, I imagine things may have changed maybe for younger women. Maybe they have it a little easier, but I still see a lot of women when we do transactions with partners that the woman is deferring to the man in that case, and he's making the majority of the decisions. And I just feel like they need to be empowered. They need to know that they've got this ability, that they do have what it takes to make those decisions, and to trust their instincts.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's interesting that it's still a common thing that the man makes most of the financial decisions.
Yeah.
And I know that the divorce rate is pretty high in the Western world. And if women don't really put themselves in a position to know their finances, to have an asset base,
Right.
even if they do sort of get, say, 50% of the assets post, the divorce,
Right.
they probably, if they don't have the financial literacy or the acumen to know what to do with it, they can squander it away, right?
Yeah, without even realizing. And one thing that women do a lot is to put their children ahead of themselves. So they'll say, well, I need to fund my child's college and make sure they have $50,000 a year to go to college. And then when they're all successful, then I'll start saving for my own retirement. And that can really set them back.
How do you address that though? Like, besides I mean, obviously mindset is very important and something I want to touch on more because I've been exploring this more and more, but really around the strategic side of it. I mean, first you got to frame it a certain way and then you got to apply it. So how would you frame it as a better approach when they do have children? Because instinctively they want to provide, and this is, you know, something that's built into all of us. Um, and it's the priority, I guess, for women because obviously you have the child. It's like an extension of you. You've nurtured and worked in your womb, and then all of that. So it's like, is there a certain amount that they have to sort of say, "Yep, now my kids are looked after. I can focus on myself," or do you kind of frame it where they, you know, by looking after themselves, they're able to then look after the kid as well?
Yeah, I mean, women are, I think most women are inherently logical. So when you show them the numbers, that you show them how it can work, where if they provide for themselves and they create that passive income for themselves, it's not just going to provide for their child during school, it's going to provide for them for forever potentially, which, in some ways it might not be the best thing because people should all be allowed to discover what they're great at and to learn what you have to learn in order to become financially independent yourself. Like, I don't, and I guess that to me is like, do you give all your money to your kid or do you allow them to have the pleasure of earning their first car and earning their whatever? But all that sort of philosophy aside, you there are a lot of ways once you have income, once you have that passive income, once you have a property, once you have a property, like this whole tax-free world opens up to you. And you can do things like pay your child to mow the lawns and that's a way to finance their college education in a much more tax-friendly way. So when you start to sort of sit down and you say, okay, what are your actual goals? And then let's figure out how to get there, right? Does it make sense for you to just save $250,000 in the bank, in some random savings account for your kid's college? Or are there better ways to make sure that you have at least this, $50,000 a year or whatever it's going to take to send your kid to school?
Mm, yeah, that makes sense. So, in a sense, it really is holistic because you have to kind of meet them where they're at,
Yeah.
right? And address their concerns. And one of the things that I've started to look into a lot, and we talked about mindset, is our cognitive biases. So, and cognitive biases are interesting because we all have them, and sometimes well, actually, majority of the time, people are unaware of them,
Yeah,
right?
by
Whether
definition, you have no clue you have that.
yeah, that's right. It's a bias. But exposing that is probably, I think, the most important thing at the beginning is actually bringing it to your awareness so then you can make change. And I think this is the sort of the goal in life for any form of self-improvement, self-actualization, wealth creation, is to actually change your behaviors. Because it's like that old saying is you can't keep doing what you've been doing and expecting something different.
Right, exactly. That's the
Yeah,
definition of insanity.
definitely insanity. Exactly.
Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result.
Yeah, exactly. And and in this space that we're in property investing, it really does come down to making, it's either a big move or incremental changes, but in the right direction. And one of the things that came up in a conversation yesterday, actually, with a potential client, a prospect, was talking about our self image. Um, and there's a book I read a while ago. It's an old book called Psycho Cybernetics. I don't know if you've ever read it before.
I have it
Um,
now.
but what it talks about, so there's a couple of people that are in the personal development space that are advocates of the book. One is Bob Proctor, who's
Mhm.
passed away now. Uh,
Yes.
Everyone would have heard of him. He was in Secret. He's Canadian, so he talked about that book a lot.
Yeah.
And then I found out the other person that was an advocate of the book was a guy named Ivan Misner, who's
Hmm.
the founder of BNI Global.
Yep.
He read that book when he was about 17, I believe. So that changed his whole trajectory. And it's quite interesting that when you read the book, it talks about the the human brain has a self-corrective mechanism, and and the analogy is comparing it to, say, an airplane. It has a flight path, and all it takes is a couple of degrees out, and it will end up in a totally different location. So really, the self-correcting mechanism in the airplane is that if it starts to veer off the trajectory, it will self-correct, so it still ends up at that target location. And our brains have a similar mechanism when it comes to our self-image. So if you consider that your self-image says that I have only ever earned, say, $80,000 a year.
Yeah.
That's the limit to how much I've ever earned. And that's how much, and that's more than what my parents have made. And that's
Right.
more than, you know, there's an image that you create as an identity that says an 80,000 a year person lives like this. And these are the things that I get from that. And that includes struggle. So you start to get used to that. So the interesting thing is that, someone comes along like me or you and says, you can be a millionaire and invest in property, um, and build passive income that exceeds your $80,000 income. That's your annual income that you currently trade your time and labor for.
Yeah.
Um, unless you work on I guess, your self image and understand what are those cognitive biases that you have, the unconscious beliefs that are driving your behavior, then what happens is, even as you make steps forward in that direction, because you make a conscious decision to do that, your unconscious is still self correcting and saying, hey, hold off. You're
Yeah.
not a millionaire, right? You're
Right.
you're $80,000 a year person. So it will actually
Exactly.
self sabotage and actually say, go spend that money. Don't, look at things that are actually going to help you get there, because that's not who you are. This
Yeah.
is who you are.
Right.
And then, I don't know, from my experience, is that if you're not aware that this is, I guess, a protective mechanism, then you're going to see it as a threat. You're going to say, there's a part of me that's sabotaging. And then you create an inner conflict within yourself, because you don't agree with that part of you saying, go for 80 grand. And your
Mhm.
conscious self is like, no, I want to be a millionaire. So then you have this inner turmoil, which obviously is not going to help you achieve what you're after, because you're in conflict.
Right.
Um, is there anything in there that you've sort of looked into, or is there some other ways that you can frame it?
Well, it's definitely, the other thing that goes along with that, which is, I think, also a cognitive bias, is that if I don't work really hard for this money, then I don't earn it, I don't deserve it, I'm going to lose it, or I'm not worthy, or, that there's all the imposter syndrome that's also a part of that. Because we do, and not when I say we, I mean we sort of middle and lower class um, people who've been raised with this idea that, you have to work really hard, you have to earn what you make. And, really real estate investing, once you've made the initial purchase, it's really not a lot of work. So what does that mean, right? Am I just like, and the other part is that rich people are bad and they have to be selfish and evil, and right, there's that whole Scrooge and um what's the other guy?
Lex Luthor.
Yeah, these people who have money that we're used to seeing on television or whatever, and they're all selfish and they're all miserly and they're all miserable, unhappy, lonely people living in a dark room, Like, is
Yeah,
that what, right? And that's what you're going to aspire to. Yeah, you can be that too. Like, seriously?
yeah,
So, yeah, you need to start really slowly and help people um to realize what those are, right? So when you start talking about like, oh, what do you want? Well, I want to have lots of money. Why? Like, what does that mean to you? What does lots of money mean to you? And a lot of times it just means freedom. It just means that you have some options and you can have fun, and you don't have to, worry about maybe getting a first class airline ticket or going on a really fun vacation, because you know that there's that, the money train is still chugging out more money next month. So you can spend everything you make because more stuff's coming. Hey, and that takes time, and it takes lots of sort of self talk, I guess you could say. It takes lots of um, questions, lots of coaching, lots of people kind of really being honest about where they are and what it is that they really want. Because I don't know, for me, like to aspire, like, oh, my goal is to have $5 million in the bank. Well, yawn, I mean, what's fun about having $5 million in the bank? It's why would I want that? Well, okay, because I want to be able to, pick some stuff. I want to be able to take an around the world cruise. I want to be able to buy all my family houses. I want to be able to do whatever. So that's actually the goal. And that's the thing you're going to get fired up about, not just watching money accumulate, which, I mean, there is a certain probably sort of person who enjoys that. But like for me, I want the fun that comes from the money, that it's a tool. And when you accept that it actually is just a tool, then you can start to think about how you want to use that tool instead of worrying about this thing about all these labels about richness and oh,
Yeah,
I've got fire, I've got whatever. So
makes
I don't know.
sense.
Yeah, it's a lot of conversations, I guess.
So, no, this is really good because I think it's hearing the perspective from both of us is going to help the listeners who really want to make a change in their life
Yeah,
to, I guess, yeah, what we talk about, frame it a different way, understand what are the mechanisms and the systems that have influenced them to look at money and wealth a certain way, which is um, basically holding them back from achieving what they actually want in life.
yeah,
And you mentioned movies, and that sort of, yeah, Scrooge is one example. Mr. Burns is another. Um, uh, Lex Luthor from Superman, right? Everyone you see who has a lot of money typically looks like, yeah, they're the bad person in the story, and the one that doesn't have so much money is a supposed good person, right?
right,
Superman lives on a
exactly.
farm, doesn't really have much money,
Yeah.
works a sort of an
But they're
admin role.
happy.
Yeah, but they're happy.
And they have love.
Yeah,
Rich people never have love in the
yeah,
movies.
yeah, that's right,
They have
exactly.
a lot of empty people who just care about their money, right? No one's gonna love me for myself now that I'm
Yeah,
so rich. Oh my God. Right? There's just so much of that.
yeah, and I think that's the part where you can lose yourself is when it's the pursuit of the money in itself, without
Yeah.
going beyond that and saying, what's the money for? If the money is
Right.
going to be used, because money's, in my view, is supposed to flow, right? That's why they say
Right.
cash flow. So it's not called cash hoard, right? Like,
Right.
it's,
Well, and then somebody said to me one time, money is a liquid asset. You have to let it flow. I'm like,
yeah,
that's perfect. I just love that.
it's liquid, exactly, liquidity,
Mm,
you know. And other thing is, what's the other thing? This is from Ray Dalio. He said one man's expense is another man's income, right?
yeah,
Or woman for that matter. But as you spend somewhere, someone else receives it.
exactly.
So, and it's just about not spending everything. Like, oh, everyone gets to receive it. Now all of a sudden you're out of money. It's like you said, having that recurring income coming in every single month,
Yeah.
and it doesn't matter if you spend because you've got more to come in and top it up. So
Yeah.
you're not overspending.
And
So
that brings out generosity. I mean, people like when you have lots of money, it doesn't mean that you have to like hoard it all. Like you said, it's not money hoarder, it's cash flow. And you can, discover the things that you want to support, the organizations, the people, the whatever, if you like care about the arts or children or your church or whatever that may be, you now have the power to help those institutions to thrive. And so yeah, that's the other thing, like the rich man in the eye of the needle stuff, well, okay, but show me a church that doesn't ask for collections. You know what I mean?
yeah,
But it's just if whatever it is that you care about and believe in, you now have the power to help to support that.
exactly. And it leads me to something that I'm currently working on, um, which I mentioned to you before we started recording the podcast. So my team and I are putting together basically it's a wealth profile quiz. So where someone can answer questions about how they respond to certain situations in the past, as behavioral type questions, and then they're going to be able to understand themselves at a deeper level. What are their cognitive biases around money, and what sort of archetype or profile do they sort of fit in? Are they more sort of that conservative? Are they more risk takers? Um, And I think when people understand themselves at a deeper level and they know where their goals are, then they'll say, okay, these are my traits, but are those traits helping me achieve those goals, or are they holding me back? So they're also going to put in some recommendations around how to improve themselves in the behaviors, I guess, so that they can achieve those goals. So that's what we're in the process of developing that, and should be released
Fun.
very, very soon. Um, and I think that's kind of the thing that, if you think about the altruism side, something that has really stuck with me, because I have a mission in life and in my business. It's a pretty big mission, but it's something that I'm pursuing, and I'm sharing it to my clients now. I'm at that point where I'm like, you know what? If my clients don't get that, then they're not the right fit. So and it takes us a bit to do that, because we have this part of our um, security. Everyone has our, our needs, right? Which is our survival needs, our safety and security, um, and providing for family. And you mentioned about women who want to provide for their children. I feel like a lot of good people get stuck in the providing. So they get past survival, shelter, food, and power, because we have to pay for electricity. I don't know why that is, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Another story.
utilities.
Yeah, pay to live society, right? If you don't have money,
That's for
your
sure.
survival is at risk. So if you get past survival, you want to provide for your family, whether that's your parents because they look after you and they don't have much money, or your children, of course, because you want to set them up in a life that that give them better life than you had. But if you don't sort that out or figure that out, then all those aspirational things inside that make you want to do good in the world, whether it's to give to a charity, a foundation, um, support, a cause that's close to your heart, give to your community, things like that, you don't end up getting to do that because you're stuck in, "No, I need to look after my family first." And so basically, what I was trying to say is that my mission is to help good people become wealthy, and to help wealthy people do more good.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. and,
Nice.
and if you break that down, firstly, it's like, how do I identify who the good people are? Right. And it's not about judging, right? It's not about sort of putting myself in a position to say, I'm good, you're bad. It's that what I'm trying to do is help the people that having more money means that once they get past the providing, they will actually use that money to do more good. They're
Right,
not trying to um, inflate their social status, all right, or their position in society, and show off their wealth on social media, um, and whatever it is, buy boats, cars, watches, um, even just that whole Joneses thing, right? Trying to keep up with the Joneses. If I don't want to, because I know what I like. I can, the knowledge that I have and the connections that I have will make people wealthy, significantly wealthier than they would otherwise if they didn't
right,
follow these steps. So I need to be careful that I don't end up helping people that are more self-interested than they are in service to others. So this quiz is helping me to find those people, to unpack that truth, and say, if they get more money, are they actually going to do good, or are they going to be the type that either shows it off, or another level just keeps hoarding it, right? Building up, like I said, 5 million in the bank, ten
right,
million, whatever it is, and it's not flowing. Like, so how does that help the world?
right.
So so that's my mission, and that's what I'm aspiring to do with this quiz, with the business, with the property investments. And I guess I'd like to actually, firstly, before I start talking about your stuff, what's your thoughts on all of that?
I think it's beautiful. I love it. It's reframing what the idea of wealth, right? Reframing what it means to be wealthy and your social responsibility that goes along with having maybe more money than some other folks in your community.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And then there's an interesting stat, and this is something I validated over the weekend on ChatGPT, just to make sure that my theory was correct. So the interesting thing about money in the whole world is, say we have 8 billion people. I don't know the exact amount, and all the money in circulation and all the assets owned um, is in the, you can't even quantify it. It's in the trillions. We only know about what's publicly known, like Forbes list and, the
Right,
big,
right,
big tech companies and things like that. But the ultra wealthy are not public about it.
right.
So they don't want their names known out there. It's even beyond ultra wealthy. And this is how you need to understand how ultra it actually is. 0.001% of the population own and control more money and assets than the remaining 99.999% combined. So that, if you think that means that 7,000 individuals, right, relative to 8 other billion, have more money and influence and control than the other remaining 8 billion. So in comparison, and I try to have an analogy here. If all the 8 billion people were using sand, uh, and sand was, each grain was basically like, $1, or let's even probably say even more than that.
Yeah.
We that 8 billion, including us, would be playing in a sand pit, right? And the other 7,000 that control the real money in the world are having access to the remaining sand on the earth. That's the actual difference of money. So we're playing literally this game of like 80,000 a year or $1 million, which is
Yeah,
not even
it's
a
no
peanut.
matter what, it's still nothing, so don't worry about it.
It's nothing, yeah. And the interesting thing is that they are the level of money that they own and control is beyond risk taking. So they can make moves and invest. And I gave the comparison of a $50 million investment into tech. Their returns, even at a conservative 2% returns on the potential trillions of dollars of assets they own, they would have that repaid within 3 months. So they're beyond risk. They don't actually, no matter what moves they do, their returns are going to be higher than that spend. So yeah, it's crazy. Did you know these stats? You
I
probably
did
knew.
not.
You didn't? Yeah.
Yeah.
So it makes you really, put it into perspective that if you were in that position, in that 7,000, and you had that level of money and control, um, you would likely create systems that protected you from ever losing that,
Yeah.
or ever exposing that this is how you operate and how things really work. So you would create systems such as the education system, right? The energy system, the food system, the health system, governments,
Yeah.
politics, wars, banking. You would create that in a way that everyone else has to play in that sandpit world while you're in the real world making
Yeah.
the global moves.
Yeah.
So so that's basically the world that we live in. And you have to kind of break that down and say, you know what? I'm not going to be influenced with the television, because television means to tell a vision or tell live vision, right? Right? Um, I'm not going to be influenced by the history that they tell us, because history means his story. So they're giving us a story that we then believe to be
Right.
true,
Right.
and we just run with it, right? So
Yep.
we got to create our own story
That's right.
and our own future. If you think about, there's always this saying in movies and things where it's like when someone in power comes in, they don't say we're going to change the future. They always say we're going to change history. Right? So, so they literally come in and change history, and they change the books, and they start teaching a narrative that says that
Right.
they were the ones that were making it. So you got to be like, wait a minute, why do I keep listening to this and believing that this is actually how it was? What's in my control? What story can I change and can I write? So this is the story that I'm creating and I'm putting out to the world, is that, you know money is not going to change you. Money is going to highlight more of who you actually are, because now you'll have the means to actually do more with the money.
Right.
And the idea of being authentic in this world is about being congruent with your thoughts, your feelings, your words, and your actions. Get all them in alignment. It doesn't matter what other people say,
Right.
right? It doesn't matter how much money you actually have relative to your neighbor or your sibling or your best friend. None of that matters because you're being who you are,
Right.
you know? And if that means that you become a multi millionaire and that ends up, helping third world countries that live on $2 a day, right? Or if it means you provide education to kids who didn't have education at a
Yeah.
young age because they were born into poverty, or if it means helping these families, you know, have the financial literacy and some funding that they can actually afford to keep their children. They don't have to sell their children into slavery. And that's a real thing. That's a
I
really
know.
dark thing that happens in this world, and it still happens. And you think with the trillions and trillions of money that's actually out there, owned and controlled by a select few, they can't just solve this.
Right.
To me, that says they're probably part of the problem and actually
Yeah, they
part
probably
of the
don't
solution.
care too much, or else it's the problem they created.
Exactly. So it's up to us, the listeners, and you and I, Christine, to actually
Right.
figure out how do we work together. And this is where the collaboration and cooperation trump competition. All right. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
not Donald Trump, but Trump as in right? um, yeah. So when it comes to investment in the US, this is where, I mean, maybe you can share, what do you think is going to be a significant change now that Trump is in government? Because he's obviously trying to pull more resources into the US. This is going to attract a lot more investment in the US, would you say?
Yeah, that's the theory. I mean, and I think that's his goal, right? To create wealth, or to attract wealth for this country, or maybe just for himself. But I think, we could all we could go right on his coattails, perhaps.
Yeah.
But also, he's very real estate friendly, right? He owns real estate himself. Obviously, he's created wealth through real estate himself, and there's some indication that he could at least like make some tax laws, for example, that are going to be favorable and encourage people to purchase real estate. Um, right now, one of the challenges is interest rate, so it's a lot more expensive for somebody to get started if they're going to take out a loan than it was for them, 3 years ago or whatever. But yeah, I don't know exactly what's gonna happen. It's very interesting. Even like we're a lot of the towns and areas that are having housing shortages, some of those housing shortages are caused by, that we have a lot of immigrants in the area and they need to have a place to live. Well, if he kicks out all the immigrants, then maybe we're gonna have a lot more space. I don't know. So it's interesting. So it could go either way, right? That would create a glut because we've been building so much new real estate, so many new residential structures that maybe we won't need them anymore. I don't know. It's very interesting. It'll be kind of fun to sit back and watch and see what happens over the next few years.
That's a really good point. I didn't think about that, the immigrants, because a lot of them are the tenants that you end
Yeah,
up, if you're the landlord or the investor,
right,
they're the ones paying the rent because they
right,
need home. They're looking for housing. So
right,
if they're out and then you have a whole bunch of supply and not the same level of demand, then you might end up with a vacant property that you've taken out a mortgage on
right.
that you're still liable to pay it. But the interesting thing in America, and correct me if I'm wrong here, um, you have a law that says that if you can't afford to pay your mortgage, you can literally hand back the keys to the bank, and it doesn't matter if that property is the value or the sale price is less than the debt. They have to basically write it off. They're not able to pass on that loss to you as the borrower once you give back the property. Is that true?
Well, not 100%. They do no it depends how you go about it, right? There's a short sale where you're gonna sell the property for less than you owe the bank, and before the bank approves that, they'll do a lot of research into you and see if they can figure out if you actually did have assets and money that you weren't telling them about, because they can go after you, and that also becomes taxable. Not that that's a big deal, but, if you say you write off $100,000, that gets added to your income, so you're gonna have to pay tax on that at the end of the year. So the government at least is going to get their thing. But yeah, it's very expensive to foreclose on someone. So to take the house from them is expensive. It takes years and costs in excess, much more than 60,000, sometimes over $100,000 to get that property back from them. So the bank it's in their best interest if you are willing to just hand them the keys and they just decide that, yeah, they really just don't have any more money to give us, just to take the keys and get it on the market so that they can cut their losses as far as legal fees and holding costs and winterizing the property and, doing whatever they're going to need to do to keep it from being destroyed while they try to get rid of it. So,
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's why people look for these distressed properties when they invest because they're able to get um a steal, for lack of a better word, right?
yeah. Well, I went and looked at a property the other day that was on the market. It was a foreclosed property, and the first notice that got put into the deed. So the first time that the bank was actually saying that they were going to foreclose on the property was 2022, and it just went up for auction at well below its value because the roof was leaking and there was mold now and the ceilings are starting to collapse because the bank hasn't done anything to it for the last 3 years or longer while they've been trying to figure out where are the people, can we get some more money from them, blah, blah, blah. If the people would have just given them the keys 3 years ago, then, it would have sold 3 years ago and the property probably would have sold for more. So
That
it,
makes,
it does make good sense, normally for the bank, but it's an economic decision. It's not as if it's a law that they have to take the keys.
yeah, interesting. If you if you have other properties and they like say your principal place of
Hmm.
residence, do you call it that, or do you call it owner occupied? What's the wording?
Yeah, principal residence or owner occupied, both of them are,
Yeah.
are
Okay, so your
terms that
principal
we
residence.
use.
So say you get your principal residence and then you own a rental,
Yeah.
and the rental is one of these in an area that has immigrants that move out and you can't afford the mortgage anymore.
Yeah.
Um, if you hand the keys back, say it's 30,000 less if they were to sell it today versus the mortgage
Yeah.
um, amount, can that bank, say you're at, I don't know, Bank of America, and then your principal places with um, Chase Bank, for example, could does that mean you've got sort of like this shelter around your principal place because you're with a different bank? Or because you hand the keys back, can they then say, no, you've got equity in your principal place, you now need to sell that to pay off that 30,000?
They can record a lien on that other property, but there's a thing called homestead, which is something that gets filed, and they can't force you to sell the property to pay off a debt up to a certain amount. So if I'm a single person and I have at least 200,000, I think it's $200,000 in equity, then they can't force me to sell the house. If and then once you have over 200,000, I think then you lose that much, but like that 200,000 is protected or what. And if you're married, then it's twice as much. I think it's 200,000 per person. So in other words, if I just bought my house a few years ago and I only have 50,000 in equity, nobody can force me, no debtor can force me to sell my property to satisfy the debt. That does not include the US government. So if it's taxes, they can force you to do it, but another bank, they would just record a lien, and when and if you sold the property, then that's when they'd get their money, but they couldn't force a sale in most
Okay.
cases.
Okay, so a lien is like equivalent to a caveat that we have here. So it's like
Okay,
a,
yeah,
it's basically on the title, so that if you try to sell, that needs to be removed first before you
exactly.
can receive funds for the sale.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, interesting. So I was just comparing, because one of the reasons that I do what I do is because this actually happened to my parents many years ago. They were sold into an investment, brand new investment in Queensland, which is another state in Australia,
Mhm.
and there was no strategy, there was no planning, there was no finance buffers put in place, there was no insurances, like personal insurances. There was no there wasn't really any stress testing done even for themselves to figure out can they afford it if things don't go the way they envisage it would go. So they ended up in financial hardship because everything happened all at the same time. Tenants moved out. My mum was out of work for a period of time. The value of the property went down because there was some changes in, I can't remember if it was bushfires or flooding.
Mhm.
There was other costs that they didn't account for because they bought it what's called off the plan. So it was built after they committed to the purchase, and then they found out the expenses later. One of those was it was part of a gated community, so they had to pay for someone to sit there all day and whatever,
Right.
right?
Right.
And they didn't know about that. They thought it was freestanding, and so basically the loan was frozen for a period of time under financial hardship. But in the end, they had to get permission to sell it from the bank at a loss. So they sold it for $20,000 less in order to get out of that loan. But what it didn't account for was they also contributed a deposit from the equity in their principal place, which is about 100,000. So that loan was secured against the principal place, and it was still there. Now they had
Yeah.
no house to show for it, and they still owed the bank 20,000.
Wow.
Um, and because of that 20,000, they didn't do a lien or a caveat against their principal place, but what they did do is they wrote it off, so they didn't chase them for the 20,000, but
Mhm.
they gave them both defaults, so they defaulted their credit files for
Yeah.
5 years, so they were never able to obtain credit ever again after that.
Oh
Um,
boy.
yeah, and in the end, they had to sell the home after a few years because I moved out, my brothers moved out. They did have equity, and they helped me buy my first investment property. It didn't go to plan because I didn't apply the strategies that I knew. I was quite young at the time. um, so it wasn't really a pure investment. It was more of a downsizing, owner occupied, with
Yeah.
me as the borrower and the owner, and their equity as the cash contribution. That Look, everything happens for a reason. So I don't look at it from a sort of a victim mentality. They are now in their late 70s with no assets to their name, uh, renting and on social security to live. And they're baby boomers. So if they did things correctly and they had the right support around them, a good team that actually did things not for self interest, but actually to help them
Yeah.
unpack their goals and really set up the right strategies, the right research, all of the stuff we talked about,
Yeah.
they would be multimillionaires. They'd be part of that, you know, generational wealth transfer that's currently going on.
Yeah.
Uh, but because of a couple of wrong moves along the way, uh, they're in that sort of yeah bottom of society in terms of earnings, which is really sad because it does happen. Just one mistake. In saying that, it wasn't just that one mistake. It was a lot to do with money management and also mindset.
Mhm.
So, you know, I think one of the things that doesn't get spoken about enough is the way couples communicate about money and the
Mm.
way couples set up goals and figure out a budget and stick to it and don't lie and hide money and hide debt and credit cards and pretend or hold on to this independence and freedom that they think
Yeah.
they have by not telling their partner about it. um, that sort of thing isn't really spoken about enough, and I think that's really a very important thing that we should discuss. And I'd like to sort of ask you, when you deal with couples, do you find that this stuff really starts to surface and becomes exposed when you start asking them questions?
Oh yeah. It's incredible how even looking for a property, one person thinks it'd be great to have an older home and the other person thinks no, and they want a home they can just, just built that they can just walk right into. One person, thinks that a fixer upper would be fun, and the other one thinks that they want a place they don't even have to change the paint color. But for sure, when it comes to money and And it becomes normally in the first few minutes, as you start to ask questions, as I start to ask questions, that becomes uncovered. Like one person is reticent about even having an investment because they have student loan debt, and the other person is saying, we're never going to be able to pay off the student loan debt unless we buy this property, right? So you really have to bring people together and make sure that because they'll sabotage each other, right? And if there's even a glimmer of uncertainty, then you've got everybody sabotaging each other and a big mess, and no one's going to succeed. So you really have to figure that out, unpack people's priorities and their feelings about money and debt, because that's another thing. Like, well, I'm trying to talk my mother out of paying off a thing now. She just had some dental work done, and they gave her a 0% interest credit card. And she's like, I really want to pay this off. I'm like, Mom, even if you just take the money and put it in an account that's getting 0.05% interest, you're still in better shape than you are if you pay that off. Like, do you understand? Like, oh, but I hate having debt. Set it up to be automatically repaid. Like, oh my God, everybody has this idea that, no debt. But that's where, maybe you give them some homework, go read Rich Dad, Poor Dad, go figure out like what is good debt and how can you use debt as a tool in order to increase your actual wealth at the end of the day, even on paper, right? It's not just, I don't know, having no debt, but also no assets is not necessarily going to put you in a place where you can stop working, where you can, fund anything in particular. So yeah, communication's big.
Yeah, there was a lot in that actually, and I want to sort of talk a little bit around the relationship dynamic. Everyone has got you know experiences that they've had from childhood that have shaped their perception around amount money, debt, wealth, as well as all the TV influences and education. Right, they don't teach you around financial literacy, how to manage money, even the language of money. Right, balance sheet, profit and loss, net profit,
Right.
EBITDA. And I was like, what
Yeah.
is all this stuff?
Right.
And they do it intentionally, so it's so confusing that people are just like, nah, this isn't me. I'm not into numbers. I don't
Right.
understand finance. So then they just go about not learning the fundamentals of money. And money is something that we've, as much as it's something that we don't like, we're the only species on the planet that has this, right? Everyone
Right.
else like has works in cooperation and it just blends into the ecosystem, but humans don't, right? They create and the way money is really spent and felt about it depends on how it was earned as well. It's not
Yeah,
just
true.
if you've worked, like you said, if you worked hard for it, you're less likely to go spend it on a weekend away so quickly, um or maybe a weekend away you will, but let's just say to just whatever, what's the equivalent, like something that you don't have to think about, you just
Yeah.
but if you want it, the races or something, um, you probably put it back into another bet, right?
Right,
So,
exactly.
so there's so much like different meaning that people give to money and to debt, and it's molded by our experiences, by what we were taught by our family, what we absorbed from our parents. So if they had arguments around money when we were really young, we would have an association to say that money causes problems in relationships.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to really bring that to the surface and say, what are these unconscious stories that you're carrying about money that aren't actually true, that are just there, that I'm feeling and thinking and acting out on, or the behavior side,
Right.
and change it. And I think the relationship dynamic is a really important one because you have to know what your partner's stories are around money,
Right.
and you need to be open to communicate what your stories are. And it's never going to be exactly the same, but at least you can come to an agreement that you're doing it for the greater good of your family and your partnership and your children
Yeah.
and whatever it is, looking after each other's parents at an older age, um, getting that that dream kitchen for the home, you know,
Yeah.
going on that yearly holiday, but just aligning those goals that you're both working toward that, because that's what my wife and I did at an early stage. Like we had a joint bank account pretty quickly. But first year we were together,
Mhm.
and I wasn't in the greatest position. I had quite a bit of debt that she didn't know about, and um, and she thankfully she stayed with me, but because she was considering going back, she moved from Germany to Australia to be with me, and then later on found out about all my debt. Um, but it wasn't necessarily bad debt. It was just badly managed debt from my end. Like I let it accumulate. I always stayed on top of it, but I let it get to a point where I had to basically go back to work instead of continue with my business.
Mhm.
Um, but what we did was we actually looked at our expenses. We went to our bank and we printed out like 3 months of transaction of all of our spending, and
Mhm.
we went to the park, like somewhere outside of our home, which is a regular environment where you can be distracted, or you can go to the room and close the door, and you can avoid dealing with it, because people want to avoid it. As soon as they get a little bit tense, they get teary, they get defensive, and they just don't want to talk about it anymore. Right?
Yeah.
Put their foot down. No, I'm not talking about it.
Yeah.
Especially if it's in front of a professional, they're like embarrassed and they don't want to talk about it. So you have to do it just between you and your partner, and this is how we did it. We went to a park, we printed out the transactions, we brought a highlighter of different colors, different highlighters, and we started to highlight all of our transactions and categorize them. What were the bills and the fixed costs, and what were the stuff that was more discretionary,
Mhm.
um, going out and things like that. And we came up to figures, and just to have a real understanding of how do we actually spend our money and what's the amount. And
Mhm.
then we figure out how much do we actually want to spend going out together, and how much do we want to spend as individuals, because you got to have your freedom as well. You can't just have everything joint. You got to still have your personal account.
Right.
And we set up multiple bank accounts, and we had a purpose for each of them. One of them was our long-term savings, to save for a deposit to buy our first property. Actually, it was for travel, that after COVID we made it for a property, but initially it was actually for travel, and it accumulated. That was the one we don't touch. And the other one was our bills account, so all of our fixed costs. So that's where our main income would go into, both of our salaries.
Mhm.
And then we would transfer out for groceries in a separate account, because that's we have a budget how much we'd spend for groceries each week. And then we even had one for my parents, because I was paying them back some money that they had basically lent, which was around the property investment that I talked about. There was some that I used for my own business that I wanted to pay them back, so we were allocating money for that, paying them actually, so they had a little recurring income of debt repayment coming
Right.
through for a period of time. Um, and then we had our personal accounts, the ones that we was guilt-free spending. I'd have my own, that I can. For me, I'd buy coffees or go out and do my own thing, but my wife couldn't really say anything because she had no visibility, and that was the agreement we had. And
Mhm.
for her, she would save hers, and that was like only like $50 a week or something like that we were working off of. It wasn't much, but it just gives you that feeling that you can, and then you have a limit to how much you can go. If you spend your 50 in that week, too bad, you can't have any more.
Right.
Right? And that's how we got ahead. And then with the bills, it was around making sure that that account always had enough between one paycheck to the next to cover the bills that were due.
Mhm.
And sometimes people don't monitor their bills, especially if they come out annually or biannually, right? Every 6 months,
Mhm.
you forget about them.
Right.
But,
Right.
but if you track them, then you're always prepared for them. You put money aside for them. And that's what a lot of people don't do. So then what ends up happening is they pull away from their savings account or their long-term stuff because they didn't account for it. And now they're behind again. So, or they use a credit card, and now they're chasing their tail to actually, spend more than they actually earn. So
Right.
this is the setup to spend less than you earn. Um, do you go that granular with your clients when it comes to spending, or because you're on the real estate side and not on the finance side, you don't open up as much around the granular?
It depends when they come to me. A lot of times people already have some savings and they, before they decide that they want to get involved in real estate investing, a lot of times they put some money aside. But sometimes we have to go to that level. Sometimes when you start looking at their credit score and things like that, you realize that they don't even they haven't been on top of that, right? That's sort of the first step for us. We have to look at their credit score because that's going to define whether or not they're going to be able to get a loan if that's their goal. I mean, sometimes people just come with cash and they just want to do their thing and that's easy. But a lot of times that's not the case. They want to get a loan for this. So you're like, okay, well, let's try to talk to a loan officer. Let's get you pre-approved. And that's when you find out that they have, stuff just hanging around on their credit report that they haven't been paying attention to, that they haven't looked at. It might be, a utility bill from 5 years ago that they moved and they never got the final bill or something silly, and it's impacting their credit score. So we start cleaning that stuff up. And that's not all of the people where we really have to get to that level. But if they don't already have a handful of money that they've already put aside for investing, then we have to keep digging down and digging down, because sometimes it is going to be a 6-month plan, a 1-year plan, even longer before they're actually in a position where it makes sense for them to start investing in real estate.
Yeah, yeah, that makes total sense. So really, it's good to be able to kind of help the people that want to get ahead, find
Yeah,
strategies to get them there, but really they're not your ideal client in the exact moment, but they will be your ideal client over time.
right.
Yeah. Yeah,
Right.
that's
And I
similar
love
to me.
developing relationships with people and, getting to know them and watching them, make those wins and really succeed. It's fun.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Oh, awesome. That's really good. I wanted to ask around just last thing to before we wrap it up. We really have been talking, nearly an hour actually, which is great. Um, Around if someone from Australia wanted to buy property in the US through yourself,
Mhm.
could they borrow money from an American financial institution, even though their income is earned in Australia and they don't have Australian green card residency or citizenship? Is that possible?
Yeah, there are some banks. I mean, not like every bank. You can't just walk into any old bank, but there are some banks that will give you a 60% loan. So you'd have to put 40% down and then they'll finance the remaining 60, or 50-50 sometimes. And basically they're basing that off of the income that the property's going to make. So they figure, well, worst case, they go back to Australia, never, pay any bills. We're still going to be fine because we've already got half the value is covered and the other half, we can quickly reclaim by selling it or even by just collecting the rents and stuff. So there are a few banks that will do that. It's not the easiest thing in the world, but it is possible.
Okay, so um, if they come up with a 40% deposit and they
Hmm.
borrow 60%,
Hmm.
does that mean that the income assessment is based purely on the rental income that's being generated in the US and not on their
Right.
actual incomes in Australia?
Yeah, exactly. And even a US resident could do the same thing. Like if your property is going to make enough money to cover the mortgage, normally they factor in a 25% vacancy. If it has enough cash flow to do that, then normally, and you're putting down, you know, 20 to 40%, then you should be fine.
And the loans are for 30 years?
Yeah, normally you can get 10, 20, or 30-year, but most people go with 30 because you can always pay extra. Whereas if you get a 10-year loan, you have to pay the whole thing.
Yeah, so the repayments are higher. But
Yeah,
the
much higher.
calculations that the lenders do for that 60% calculation, and they account for 25% vacancy. So
Yeah.
really they're using about 75% of the rent,
Hmm.
essentially. If that's enough to cover principal and interest, amortization,
And
repayments over,
taxes,
and taxes.
taxes
Oh,
and
and
insurance as
taxes as well.
well.
Taxes and insurance. Oh, well, they even account for those expenses too.
Yeah.
Okay. And then they'll lend the money over 30 years. So even if you then have a tenant that moves out and it exceeds the 25% vacancy, you just got to come up with the money realistically. They're not going to come knocking and say, hey, we need to reassess this and
No,
we're
they
going to
really don't
refund
have
it.
any way of knowing whether or not you have a tenant as long as you're paying your bills.
Yeah, powerful. So what what's the average price point for someone who wanted to invest in the areas that you recommend or that you're proficient in, which is in the Boston area, right?
Yeah, Massachusetts and New Hampshire is where I'm licensed. And it, again, I give you these like round answers, but it sort of depends on their goals. Do they want a place that's going to be a short-term rental where they can come and visit sometimes and take their own vacations there? Do they just want to have straight income? Do they, and it's just like I'm sure in Australia, the closer you are to downtown, the nicer the property, the lower the returns that you're going to get in general. So Class A property is going to have a very low cap rate or rate of return versus a property that is, maybe in a less fancy area, or maybe the house isn't as new or whatever. Then you're going to probably make more money, but you also have more risk. So those analyses have to be done to see what the person really wants, if they want like a guaranteed payment every month, or if they're willing to, potentially have some growth, like buy a property that needs some work, update the kitchens and baths, and then get a higher return. That's a conversation that we have.
Yeah, that's a good
But
answer.
yeah, so you can get, like, I just looked at a property the other day, which is not too far. It's about, say, 45 minutes from drive from Boston, and it's somewhere you could get into Boston on the commuter rail if you wanted to take the train into Boston. So it's not terribly, terribly far from downtown. And it's a two-family house, and it was they want 280,000. But I can't get, I mean, basically, if I wanted to get downtown Boston, if I wanted to get a space in a garage parking, it would probably cost me 120,000. So it just, but that property needed work. It needed to be have all kinds of work done. And at the end of the day, it probably would be worth, once you do that work, it's probably going to be worth 500,000. You're going to be pulling, 5,000 a month out of it for rent. But that's going to require some investment. So the
Yeah.
other, like the guaranteed income, I would say is like closer to the city, where you've got students that are coming in, you've got doctors, people who are more like residents, people who are more transient. They don't want to buy a property. They're only going to be in the city for, 1 to 4 years. Um, but they're great. They have great credit. They have great income. A lot of times their parents are backing them up. In those cases, you're going to be paying. You could buy a condo for 800,000, and just pull $4,000 a month out of it. So,
Mm, yeah, makes
and
sense.
that's barely, at this point, it's not even going to cover your mortgage. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it just depends on their goals. If they want to have long term growth, like I don't care if we make. I have clients who don't care if they make money today. They just want to have that. They want to have their money growing in a different country, right? So in the States, where they feel like there's less risk, um, they would just want to have their money growing, so that at the end of whatever time, that they'll be able to sell it and most likely make a profit. So,
Yeah. Becomes
the property just has to pay for itself.
so you help calculate those numbers with clients to sort of say, all
Yeah.
right, what's that sweet spot
Yeah.
to sort of get in where it pays for itself, and leave a little bit of wiggle room if there's a little bit longer vacancy, so you're not
Or
having.
or even if there's things that, you're gonna wanna do over time, because you don't wanna just let your properties languish. You wanna keep on top of the maintenance, so you wanna make sure that you've got at least 10% a month of the rent is able to be saved, so that, for any potential problem with something breaking or whatnot.
Yeah, yeah, that's really good. So I just did a quick calculation. If it was 280,000 US dollars, that's about 452,000 Australian.
Okay.
And if you need to come up, obviously there's going to be other purchasing costs on top of that,
There is, yeah, you plan on, at least for that price property, maybe $7,000, after all is said and done, for closing costs.
including lender fees and things like that
Yeah.
as well. Okay, 287. So that's 464,000. And if you got to come up with, actually you got to come up with 40% of the purchase price, not the closing cost. All right, so 280
Right, yeah.
times 40% is 112,000 USD, which is about 181,000 Australian. You got to come up with out of pocket,
Yeah.
and then you'll make sure that if it was that particular asset, that the rent. Well, it's not just you. The bank's not going to lend 60% if the
Right.
loan if the rent won't cover all the costs, right?
Exactly, you don't have to take my word for it.
Yeah.
They're
That's
gonna
right.
be looking at all kinds of analytics about the area, so.
Okay. So I think that's, if I've got some listeners who are, in Australia, who've got equity in their properties, who've got enough capacity to extract equity of say 180,000 or 200,000, and want to run some of these numbers, you can actually set up a call with Christine, and actually start running some potential scenarios. And I'm assuming I'm not assuming, but I'm pretty certain that you're actually going through the suburb data and analytics as to why these areas, not
Yes,
just areas, have promise for future growth, but also how they've performed in the past, right?
exactly.
I think that's important to understand. If there is a downturn, what's
Right.
the risk of how far it could go downwards?
Yeah. And
And
that's a
then,
big difference by region. We saw like certain areas where, the school system's really great and everybody wants to live there. They only went down in the last big downturn. They only lost like, 5 to 20%. Whereas in another area, the values went down like 62%. So it's really dramatically different.
yeah, yeah, that's powerful. And because of the US dollar getting stronger, um, that in itself is a way to mitigate some of that
Yeah.
loss. You get
Right.
in now with the Australian dollar, and over time, yeah, who knows? And if you then sell it in the future for a profit, do you have to pay capital gains tax?
You can right now it's legal still to do a 1031 exchange. So if I sell that property and I buy another similar property, and by similar, it just really means an investment property. So I can't sell an investment property and buy a home for myself. But if I sell an investment property, whether it's residential, commercial, whatever, and I buy another investment property, I can roll that in so that I take all that profit. The whole thing has to go into the next property, and then you can do that again. You can basically do it every 2 years, where you sell your property and buy another one and don't pay any tax until at the end when you would finally sell it. So the plan really with that is to die, and then when your kids inherit, or whoever you leave it to, they inherit, then that changes the tax basis, and then you basically have never paid taxes on it.
Wow.
But that's another strategy that, you really, again, talking about their goals. We've got to find out what their long-term plan is.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's really important to know that up front so you don't end up in the wrong asset, committing to something that you're not really prepared for. And I guess being aware of what are some of those changes that are going to come in their life as well,
Right.
right? When they do have
Exactly.
kids or grandkids, and when future expenses are going to come up, do they intend on selling it? And then if they do, are they going to buy another one, or are they going to
Yeah,
cash out and bring that money back to Australia?
exactly.
And
Exactly.
um, yeah, so cool. I think it's worthwhile that we mention that for the listeners who do want to explore this as a potential investment strategy or an alternative.
Yeah.
How would they reach you? What's the best way they can find you?
You can go on my website, chrismccarron.com, and you can book a time right there if you want to do that. That's probably the easiest thing. Just book a time, get on my calendar, and we can just chat. Otherwise, you can, yeah, let's just make it easy and stick with that. From there, you can explore all the wild things that are going on, and you can look at the podcast like the one that you're on. You can look at my book. You can look at
Your
real
podcast.
estate. You can look at my co-working space. You can have all kinds of fun
Awesome.
experiences and
Yes.
get to know me really well. So,
Well, I think that's important for anyone who's the first time hearing you is to find your content and
yeah,
listen to it, get to know what you're all about, and probably do a bit of homework. I think it's good to be more informed in the first call
definitely,
rather than sort of
definitely.
going in a blank slate and say, "Teach me everything." I think it's important to have some information at hand so you can ask better informed questions,
Yeah.
more educated questions. Um, and then if you're someone who is a potential client of mine, what we could do as a first step is actually work out how much equity do you actually have, how much is accessible, how much can you borrow,
Hmm.
what's the interest rate and the cost of borrowing that equity, so that when you book a call with Christine, you work out, okay, yes, the rent will cover the American costs, but will it also cover the equity loan that I'm taking out in Australia? And if it
Exactly.
doesn't, then you got to figure out, do you have the budget to cover that? Because that's going to be an ongoing cost that you take out. If
Right.
you're not contributing cash, that's not interest bearing. If you take it out, then you're going to have to account for that interest cost as well.
Right.
And if the interest only period is only up to 5 years, which it is in Australia, and you don't have the ability to then, refinance and recycle that, then, or reset that, I should say, then you're going to also have to account for principal and interest
Right.
repayments in the future. So let's work together. Let's figure that out if that's something you like. And yeah, just Christine, before before we say goodbye, I want to ask: is there any final thoughts or tips that you'd like to share with the audience?
Gee, that's a good question, Victor. I just want people to believe that they could have, like take a deep breath and imagine what it feels like to not have to worry about money, to just know that your bills are paid. You just set everything up to pay automatically every month. You never have to think about it. And you know there's always going to be enough money left over, because that is a reality that everybody can have. And you can take it from me, because at 50 years old, after a whole life of making stupid decisions, where I really started to say, you know what, I'm getting older now, you really need to pay attention and learn what you're doing, that it was possible for me to do that. So if it's possible for me, it's possible for you to get a handle on your finances, to get a handle on your life, and to imagine yourself in a world of financial freedom, which is freedom, right? The reason they call it financial freedom is because you are free of all kinds of drama.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. It's really what the podcast exists: Debt to Financial Freedom. Financial freedom is, it's having the money to have time freedom, ultimately, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I love it. Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Your
It's great.
insight. Yeah, and again, if you guys would like to listen and learn more about Christine, just find her on YouTube or podcast channels, her website, and I'll put all the links in the show notes as well. Thanks for supporting, guys. If you like the podcast, give it a thumbs up, follow wherever you're listening, and tune in for the next episode. Cheers.